Welcome back to Cyberspace, the weekly show where we help you understand your world. I'm your host, Leslie Poston, and today we're turning a skeptical eye towards some of the most enduring psychology myths that shape our beliefs and behaviors, often without us even realizing it. These myths aren't just harmless misconceptions. They're ideas that influence decisions in education, healthcare, and our personal lives. Whether you've heard that we only use 10% of our brain or believe in the Mozart effect, this episode is going to challenge some of the misconceptions that have lingered in the public consciousness for a bit too long. What makes these psychological myths so fascinating is not just their persistence, but their real-world impact. Research shows these misconceptions can have significant societal costs, from unnecessary public expenditure to potentially harmful healthcare decisions. The way these myths spread and embed themselves in our collective consciousness tells us something important about how we process and share information. The challenge we face isn't just about correcting false beliefs. It's about understanding why these psychology myths are so appealing in the first place. Often they offer simple explanation for complex phenomena, or they align with our intuitive understanding of how the mind works. As we'll discover today, the reality is usually more nuanced and interesting than the myth suggests. What's particularly concerning is how these myths can influence professional practice. Research shows that even individuals with advanced training in education or neuroscience aren't immune to believing these misconceptions. This highlights the importance of continuous critical evaluation of our beliefs, regardless of our background or our expertise. Let's start with one of the most persistent myths in psychology, the idea that people are either left-brained or right-brained. According to researchers, this dichotomy suggesting that left-brained people are logical and right-brained people are creative isn't just oversimplified, it's fundamentally incorrect. While there are indeed lateralized functions in the brain, with language typically being processed in the left hemisphere, the reality is that most cognitive tasks engage networks that span both sides of our brain. Think about it. Even something as seemingly straightforward as appreciating art or solving a math problem involves complex interactions between multiple brain regions across both hemispheres. The implications of this myth go far beyond casual conversation. As psychologists point out in their research on management and training practices, for example, this hemisphere mythology has led to questionable educational and professional development programs. Some schools have even attempted to tailor their teaching methods based on students' supposed hemispheric dominance, potentially limiting learning opportunities rather than enhancing them. How did this myth gain such widespread acceptance? The misconception stems partly from legitimate research on split brain patients in the 1960s, where the physical connection between the two hemispheres was surgically severed to treat severe epilepsy. While these studies did reveal some specialized functions in each hemisphere, the results were dramatically oversimplified in popular media, leading to the current misconception. The reality of brain function is far more fascinating than the myth suggests. Modern neuroimaging studies show that creativity, often attributed solely to the right hemisphere, actually involves complex interactions between both sides of the brain. Similarly, logical thinking isn't a purely left brain function. When we solve problems, we're engaging multiple neural networks that span both hemispheres, working in harmony to process information, to generate solutions, and to evaluate outcomes. This myth has been particularly persistent in educational settings. Research shows that even experienced educators often hold on to these beliefs, despite evidence to the contrary. The danger here isn't just about having wrong information. It's about how these beliefs might influence teaching methods and student assessments, potentially limiting rather than expanding learning opportunities. The 10% of our brain myth is another interesting example of how wrong ideas can take hold in popular culture. This claim has spawned countless self-help books and media narratives, but research repeatedly shows it's completely false. Brain imaging studies demonstrate that we use most of our brain most of the time, even during sleep. Every region has a purpose, whether it's controlling our breathing, processing our emotions, or helping us solve complex problems. What makes this myth particularly challenging is its staying power. Research revealed something surprising. Even psychology majors, who you might expect to know better, weren't significantly less likely to believe this myth than other students. This highlights how deeply ingrained such misconceptions can become in our collective thinking. The origins of this myth are actually quite interesting. Some trace it back to early neuroscience research, where scientists were still trying to map brain functions. Others attribute it to a misquote of Albert Einstein, though there's no evidence he ever made such a claim. The myth gained particular traction in the self-help movement of the 20th century, where it's been used to suggest that we all have vast untapped potential just waiting to be unleashed. From an evolutionary perspective, the myth makes little sense. Our brains consume about 20% of our body's energy, despite making up only 2% of our body weight. If we only used 10% of our brain, we would have evolved to have much smaller brains to conserve energy. Every part of the brain serves important functions, even if we're not consciously aware of them all. Modern neuroscience gives us a much more fascinating picture of brain function. Different activities engage different neural networks, and our brains are constantly active, even when we're sleeping. Even simple tasks involve multiple brain regions working in concert. When you're reading these words, you're using areas involved in visual processing, language comprehension, memory, and attention. That's far more than 10% of your brain. Now, let's talk about relationships. The idea is that opposites attract. It makes for great romantic comedies, but research tells a different story. According to work on relationship myths, people are actually more likely to form lasting relationships with those who share similar values, attitudes, and interests. This doesn't mean you need to date your clone, but these core compatibilities tend to matter more than the existing tension of opposites. This myth is particularly interesting because it seems to contain a grain of truth. We often are attracted to people who have complementary traits to our own. Someone who's more outgoing might appreciate a partner who's a better listener, for instance, but research shows that these surface-level differences matter far less than deeper similarities in values, goals, and fundamental beliefs. The persistence of this myth might actually be harmful to relationship success. When people believe that opposing personalities naturally create romantic chemistry, they might overlook important compatibility factors or dismiss legitimate concerns about fundamental differences. Research shows that shared beliefs and common backgrounds form the foundation for long-lasting relationships. What's particularly intriguing is how this myth intersects with relationship satisfaction over time. Studies have found that couples who share similar values, interests, and approaches to life tend to report higher relationship satisfaction and to stay together longer. The exciting tension of opposites might create initial attraction, but it's the similarities that tend to sustain long-term relationships. This understanding has important implications for relationship counseling and dating advice. Instead of looking for someone who's your complete opposite, research suggests focusing on finding someone who shares your core values while perhaps bringing in complementary strengths to the relationship. It's about finding the right balance between commonality and diversity. Another myth, and one that's particularly relevant to mental health, is the idea that venting anger, like punching a pillow or screaming into the void, helps release negative emotions. And it does help your body lose some tension, and while it might feel satisfying in the moment, the research shows that aggressive expressions of anger tend to reinforce and escalate angry feelings instead of dissipating them. Instead, techniques like deep breathing and cognitive reframing have been proven more effective for anger management. The persistence of this myth is particularly interesting because it seems to make intuitive sense. The idea of emotional pressure building up and needing release is a compelling metaphor, but it's not how our emotions actually work. Research in emotional psychology shows that engaging in aggressive behavior, even toward inanimate objects, can actually prime our brains for more aggressive responses in the future. This misunderstanding has real consequences in how we handle conflict and teach emotional regulation. Some anger management programs still incorporate cathartic approaches despite evidence that they're counterproductive. The metaphor letting off steam is so deeply ingrained in our culture that it's influenced therapeutic approaches and popular self-help advice for decades. What's particularly concerning is how this myth might affect children's emotional development. When we teach kids that the way to handle anger is to get it out through an aggressive action, we're potentially setting them up for difficulties in emotional regulation. Instead, research supports teaching strategies like identifying emotions, understanding triggers, and developing healthy coping mechanisms. The good news is there are evidence-based alternatives that serve a similar purpose. Certainly, techniques like mindfulness and progressive muscle relaxation and cognitive behavioral approaches for neurotypicals have been shown to be much more effective at managing anger constructively over time. They focus on understanding and processing emotions rather than just expressing them. However, new science of somatic therapy does wonders for helping you handle and express anger in a way that also respects how it impacts your body. If you are neurodivergent, you might want to check that out. Let's tackle another myth, and one that has serious implications for our legal system. And that's the idea that memory works like a video camera. According to a survey of the U.S. population, this is a widely held belief, but it's completely false. Memory is actually reconstructive rather than reproductive. Every time we recall a memory, we're essentially rebuilding it, influenced by our current knowledge, beliefs, and emotions. The implications of this misconception are far-reaching, particularly in legal contexts. Eyewitness testimony, once considered the gold standard of evidence, is now understood to be far less reliable than previously thought. Studies have shown that confident eyewitnesses can be completely wrong, and their memories can be influenced by various factors, including post-event information and the way the questions are asked. What's fascinating is how this reconstruction process works. When we remember something, we're not simply playing back a memory like a recording. We're actually creating a brand new version of the memory each time. This process can incorporate new information, new emotions, and new interpretations. And that's why our memories change over time and why different people can have genuinely different recollections of the exact same event. This understanding has led to significant changes in how law enforcement conducts interviews and how courts handle eyewitness testimony. The research has shown that even subtle changes in how questions are asked can influence how people remember events. This has led to the development of new interviewing techniques designed to minimize memory contamination. The malleability of memory also has implications for therapy and personal development. Understanding that memories aren't fixed recordings can help people process past experiences differently and potentially aid in therapeutic contexts. It's not about whether your memories are true or false, but about understanding their reconstructive nature. Misunderstandings and myths around mental health conditions are particularly concerning. Take dissociative identity disorder, or DID, formerly known as multiple personality disorder. While media portrayals might make it seem more common, it's actually a fairly rare condition that typically develops as a response to severe childhood trauma. Hollywood's dramatization of DID has created a deeply distorted public understanding of this condition. The reality is far more complex and usually less dramatic than media portrayal suggests. DID develops as a coping mechanism in response to severe, usually early life trauma, not spontaneously or as a result of adult experiences, as so often depicted in fiction. This misconception has serious consequences for people who actually live with DID. The sensationalized portrayal can make it harder for them to be taken seriously or to seek appropriate treatment. It can also lead to misdiagnoses, as clinicians might either over-identify or dismiss legitimate cases based on media stereotypes rather than clinical criteria. The current understanding of DID emphasizes its role as a protective mechanism. The fragmentation of consciousness serves as a way for individuals to cope with overwhelming experiences. Treatment focuses on integration and coping skills rather than the dramatic personality switching that is so often depicted in media. Research shows that public understanding of DID is heavily influenced by media representations that emphasize the most dramatic and sensational aspects of the condition while ignoring its underlying causes and its real impact on people's lives. There's also widespread confusion between DID and schizophrenia, which are two entirely different conditions. Schizophrenia involves a fragmentation of thinking and perception, not multiple personalities. This misunderstanding can prevent people from seeking appropriate treatment or understanding their loved ones' conditions accurately. The term schizophrenia literally means split mind, but this refers to a split from reality, rather than a splintering or splitting of personality. The confusion likely stems from this linguistic misunderstanding, combined with media portrayals that often blur the lines between different mental health conditions. This misconception has real-life consequences for people living with schizophrenia. When people expect to see dramatic personality changes, they might miss the actual, much more subtle signs of schizophrenia, which can include auditory and visual hallucinations, like hearing voices or seeing things, delusions, disordered thinking, and changes in behavior and emotion. This can delay diagnosis and treatment. Research shows that this misunderstanding contributes to stigma and to isolation. People with schizophrenia often face additional challenges because others expect them to exhibit dramatic personality changes rather than understanding the real nature of what's going on with their symptoms. Public education about the true nature of schizophrenia is crucial. Understanding that it's a condition affecting perception and thought processes rather than creating multiple personalities can help improve support for those affected and encourage earlier intervention. Parents, you might be interested in this next one: the belief that sugar causes hyperactivity in children. Despite what many of us think we've observed at birthday parties, multiple double-blind studies have failed to find any direct link between sugar consumption and hyperactive behavior in children. What we're often seeing is more likely the excitement of special occasions where sugary treats just happen to be present. This myth is particularly fascinating because it demonstrates the power of expectation in shaping our perceptions. Research has shown that parents who believe sugar causes hyperactivity are more likely to perceive their children as hyperactive after consuming sugar, even when the children haven't actually had any sugar. The origin of this myth can be traced back to the 70s when Dr. Benjamin Fungold proposed that food additives and sugar might contribute to hyperactive behavior. And while his work led to important research on food additives, any specific link between sugar and hyperactivity has been repeatedly disproven through multiple carefully controlled studies. What makes this myth persist is the context in which children typically consume sugar. Birthday parties, holidays, and other exciting events often feature sugary treats, but it's the excitement of the event itself, not the sugar, that leads to the increased activity levels. This creates a perfect scenario for confirmation bias. We remember the times when sugar consumption and hyperactive behavior coincide and forget the many, many times that they don't. Understanding this can help parents focus on more evidence-based approaches to managing children's behavior and diet. While there are many good reasons to limit sugar intake, preventing hyperactivity isn't one of them. This is one of several myths about the impact of external inputs on children. Recall our recent episodes about the myth that social media is harmful to children as another example, and go back and listen to those. The myth about subliminal messages having powerful control over our behavior has captured public imagination for decades. While research shows that subliminal cues can subtly influence attention, there's no evidence that they can compel specific actions or dramatically alter behavior or memory. This myth gained tremendous traction after James Vickery's infamous 1957 claim that he increased concession sales by flashing subliminal messages during movies. The claim was later revealed to be a hoax, but the idea had already taken root in the public consciousness. The incident demonstrates how even debunked claims can continue to influence public belief. Modern research has shown that while subliminal messages can have subtle effects again, on attention, or maybe a preference, these effects are typically found to be weak and short-lived. The idea that subliminal messages could compel specific behaviors or compel major decisions just is not supported by evidence. This understanding has important implications for advertising regulation and for consumer protection. The persistence of this myth reflects deeper anxieties about manipulation and control in a modern society. It's worth noting that obvious supraliminal messages often have much stronger effects on behavior than subliminal ones, yet we tend to worry more about hidden influences than influences that are blatant and right in front of our face. Understanding the actual limitations of subliminal influence can help make people make more informed decisions about media consumption and advertising exposure. Now we come to the Mozart effect, or the idea that listening to classical music significantly boosts intelligence, which has been greatly exaggerated. Waterhouse's critical review shows that while music can enhance mood and perhaps temporarily improve spatial reasoning skills, claims about permanent IQ increases just haven't held up to scientific scrutiny. This myth originated from a 1993 study that found college students performed better on spatial reasoning tasks after listening to Mozart. The media and commercial interest quickly transformed this limited finding into claims about music making babies smarter, spawning an entire industry of products promising to boost infant intelligence. The original research actually showed only a temporary improvement in spatial reasoning tasks, lasting about 15 minutes. There was no evidence of general intelligence improvement or long-term effects. Subsequent research has suggested that any cognitive benefits might come from improved mood and arousal rather than anything specific to Mozart's music or classical music. This case provides an excellent example of how scientific findings can be distorted as they move from academic research to popular media to commercial application. The enthusiasm for a simple solution to enhance intelligence led to misinterpretation and overstatement of the original findings. Understanding the real relationship between music and cognitive function is actually more interesting than the myth. Music can enhance learning, it can enhance your mood, and it can improve cognitive performance in various ways, but not through the simple dramatic effects promised by the Mozart effect industry. We did an episode on music and your brain a while back. You should go check it out. For our last myth today, we'll be addressing one of the most dangerous myths in modern psychology, the thoroughly, repeatedly debunked notion that vaccines cause autism. This myth has caused immeasurable harm by reducing vaccination rates and putting public health at risk, and additionally by vilifying autism. As Lewandowski and colleagues' research on misinformation shows, this kind of misconception can persist even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This myth originated from a now retracted 1998 study that had serious methodological flaws and conflicts of interest. The author of the study was later found to have manipulated data and lost his medical license. Despite this fact, the myth continues to circulate and influence healthcare decisions and vilify the lives of autistic people. What makes this myth particularly dangerous is its real-world impact. Decreased vaccination rates have led to outbreaks of preventable diseases in various communities because of this myth. The myth has also diverted valuable research resources away from investigating the actual causes of having an autistic brain and developing effective interventions for various diseases. The persistence of this myth demonstrates how emotional reasoning can override scientific evidence. A parent's natural concern for their children's well-being makes them especially vulnerable to this kind of vaccine-focused misinformation, especially when it's presented alongside what seem to be compelling personal anecdotes. Understanding how this myth spreads and persists can help us develop better strategies for communicating scientific information to the public and supporting evidence-based decision-making in healthcare. These myths persist for various reasons. They often offer simple explanations for complex phenomena, or they align with our personal intuitive beliefs about how the mind works. But understanding the reality, even if it's more complicated, helps us make better decisions about our mental health, our relationships, and our children's development. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of Cyberspace. Let's keep the conversation going and continue exploring the fascinating world of psychology and how our world works together. Join us over on Patreon, which is patreon.com/cyberspace, spelled just like the podcast title, to continue the discussion. It will always be free, just like this podcast, and don't forget to subscribe and share us on social media. I'm Leslie Poston, and remember, until next time, stay curious.